Summer, 1975. Memphis. Midnight rain. A worn-out taxi crawls through empty streets, windshield wipers fighting the storm. Behind the wheel, Frank, an ordinary man drowning in debt, haunted by hospital bills for his sick little girl, clinging to long night shifts just to keep the lights on. At the curb of a hotel, a passenger slides in. Jeans, a jacket, dark glasses. His voice is low, polite, strangely warm. He asks to ride, not to a destination, but simply through the city. To anyone else, he would be a shadow, another nameless fare in the blur of a driver's life. But this man is no stranger. Hidden behind those glasses sits Elvis Presley, though tonight he is not the king. Tonight he is only a man in search of silence, of someone who will see him without the crown. Neither of them knows what the next hours will bring. One, burdened by despair he cannot share. The other, desperate for hope he no longer believes he deserves. A chance encounter, sealed by rain and secrecy, will leave both forever changed. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The rain had been falling since late evening, steady and thin, not heavy enough to flood the streets, but persistent enough to coat the asphalt with a silver sheen. Every streetlight seemed doubled in the reflections, each lamp stretching itself across the wet pavement until the city looked like a place made of water and glass. Memphis after midnight could be cruelly quiet, but for those who worked the night shift, cab drivers, janitors, nurses, it was alive with a different kind of rhythm. Frank adjusted the wipers of his taxi, the rubber squeaking across the windshield in slow arcs. He'd been on the job for nearly 12 hours already, his back stiff from the driver's seat, his throat dry from too much coffee and too little food. A faint smell of cigarette smoke clung to the upholstery, layered over years of strangers passing through. He usually didn't notice it anymore, but tonight, with his nerves raw from worry, it seemed sharper. He had just finished a drop-off near the river when the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Pickup at the International Hotel. Entrance side. Passenger waiting." Frank sighed. The International was one of those places where the cars were usually long, black, and polished, not battered yellow taxis. But a fare was a fare. He turned the wheel, the tires hissing over the wet pavement, and headed toward the glowing silhouette of the hotel. The entrance was half covered by an awning. Valets in pressed uniforms stood by, smoking under the shelter. For a moment, Frank thought he'd be waved off, but then one of them gestured toward a figure waiting at the curb. The man was dressed plainly, almost too plainly for this address. Faded jeans, a dark jacket zipped up against the drizzle, and sunglasses that seemed strange in the middle of the night. His head was slightly lowered, as though he wanted to pass unnoticed. Without a word, he opened the rear door and slid into the back seat. Frank glanced in the mirror. He caught only the outline of a jaw, the gleam of lenses, the calm way the man settled into the seat. Something about him carried weight, though, the kind of presence you didn't expect from someone dressed so modestly. "Evening," Frank offered, his voice rough with fatigue. "Evening," the passenger replied, quiet but warm, the syllables softened by a southern lilt. Frank started the meter. "Where to?" There was a pause. "Let's just drive for now. Head downtown, maybe circle around. I'll tell you when to turn." That was unusual, but not unheard of. Drunks sometimes asked for aimless rides. Lonely folks, too. Frank nodded and pulled away from the hotel. For a while, the cab filled with nothing but the rhythm of rain on the roof and the steady drone of the engine. Street after street passed by, neon signs buzzing through the mist, the smell of wet asphalt seeping in when Frank cracked the window. "You work nights often?" the man asked after a time, his voice carrying an attentiveness that surprised Frank. "Most nights," Frank answered. "Pays the bills, at least some of them." "You got a family?" Frank hesitated. He wasn't used to passengers taking interest in his life. "Wife and a little girl. She's 8, smart as a whip, but she's been sick. Doctor bills don't come cheap. My wife's been picking up shifts at the diner, too. We're just trying to hold it together." The words slipped out before he had a chance to guard them. Usually he kept conversation light, meaningless. Tonight, though, the man's tone invited honesty. The passenger leaned slightly forward. "I'm sorry to hear that. Must be hard." Frank shrugged, though his throat tightened. "It is what it is." Silence again, but this time it felt heavier. The cab rolled past storefronts closed for the night, their windows covered in rain-streaked posters. Somewhere down Beale Street, faint music drifted out, muffled by the weather. A guitar, a harmonica, laughter from a doorway. "You like music?" the passenger asked suddenly. Frank chuckled. "Who doesn't? Though I don't get out much these days. Used to hang around clubs when I was younger. Now I mostly just hear the radio in here. What kind of songs stick with you?" Frank thought for a moment. "Old gospel tunes, maybe. Things my mom used to hum in the kitchen. And some of that early rock and roll when it first hit. Had a fire in it, you know? Something alive." The man in the back nodded slowly. Then, to Frank's astonishment, he began to hum. Just a few notes at first, low and steady, then a fragment of a melody wrapped in words, half sung, half whispered. The sound filled the narrow taxi like it didn't belong there at all, as though the voice had slipped in from another world. Frank felt the hair on his arms lift. The tune was familiar, achingly so. He couldn't place it, though, not immediately. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes fixed on the slick road ahead. When the humming stopped, silence rushed back into the cab. The man leaned against the seat again, calm as ever. "That one mean anything to you?" he asked lightly. Frank swallowed hard. Yeah, it does. My old man used to whistle it sometimes." He forced a laugh, trying to shake the strange feeling. "You've got quite a set of pipes, stranger. Ever think of singing for a living?" The passenger gave the faintest smile, visible even beneath the shadow of his glasses. "Sometimes. But tonight, I'm just riding." Frank nodded, though unease prickled at him. Something about that voice, about the way it carried both strength and sorrow, refused to leave his mind. He told himself he was tired, that long hours could play tricks, yet deep down he sensed this was no ordinary fare. The rain eased, though the streets still glistened. The cab rolled on, carrying 2 men through a city asleep, one burdened by his daughter's illness, the other hiding behind ordinary clothes and dark lenses. And though Frank didn't yet realize it, this quiet passenger, this unusual man in the back seat, was about to turn an ordinary shift into the most unforgettable night of his life. The city had quieted further as the taxi drifted south, tires whispering against streets that gleamed like obsidian under the lamps. Frank had expected the man to name a destination by now, an address, a neighborhood, maybe even a late-night diner. But instead, the request came softly from the back seat. "Don't take me home yet. Just, let's drive a while." Anywhere, Frank glanced in the mirror. The sunglasses still obscured the man's eyes, but something in his tone carried a longing, a kind of hunger not for food or drink, but for space, for anonymity. Frank didn't argue. He guided the cab toward the heart of downtown, where the night carried its own kind of pulse. They rolled past Beale Street, and even through the drizzle its glow cut the darkness. Clubs spilled laughter and the throb of guitars into the night air. Musicians lingered in doorways, protecting their instruments from the rain with old coats, waiting for another set or another drink. Frank slowed the cab instinctively, his gaze flicking to the sidewalks alive with hints of the past. "Haven't been down here in years," Frank murmured. "Used to sneak into those clubs when I was barely old enough to shave. Heard blues that could break a man open. Learned more from those nights than from school. I'll tell you that." The passenger leaned slightly forward, voice low, almost as if confessing to the window rather than to Frank. "Places like this shape a soul. When you're young and you don't have much, music gives you air to breathe. It makes you believe you can climb out of anything." The words landed with more force than casual conversation. Frank felt his chest tighten. That thought, scraping your way out of nothing with a dream, mirrored his own story more than he cared to admit. He drove slower, letting the lights of Beale flicker across the wet windshield. "You sound like you've lived it," Frank said quietly. There was a pause, then the man chuckled softly. "You could say that. Grew up without much. Folks laughed when I said I wanted to make music, said it wasn't practical. But sometimes stubbornness is the only tool you've got." Frank nodded, almost forgetting he was speaking with a fare. The man's honesty drew something out of him, a shared recognition of uphill battles. The passenger shifted in his seat, then added, "Funny thing is, no matter how far you go, those early nights don't leave you. The smell of cheap smoke in a club, the sound of a guitar crying over 3 simple chords. That stays in your bones." Frank didn't respond. His grip tightened on the wheel because he felt those words were aimed straight at him, as if the man had peeked into his own memories of cramped rooms filled with song, sweat, and laughter. And then it happened. Without warning, the passenger began to sing. Not a whole verse, not even a polished performance, just a raw fragment of a gospel tune from decades earlier. The sound filled the cramped space of the taxi and seemed to push against the windows, as though it belonged to a vast church or an open field rather than the back seat of a worn cab. The voice carried weight, velvet and steel at once, with a resonance that could not be faked. Frank felt a shock course through him, as if someone had struck his chest. He knew this sound. He had heard it on radios, on jukeboxes, pouring from dance halls and living rooms across America. It was impossible to mistake. His foot hesitated on the pedal. He pulled the cab to the side of the street, brakes squealing faintly against the wet road. The rain had slowed to a mist, droplets tracing crooked paths down the windshield. Frank turned in his seat, heart pounding. His mouth went dry, but the words forced their way out. You can't be—" The passenger leaned back calmly, a faint smile touching his lips. He tilted his head, letting the silence stretch until it felt unbearable. Finally he said, "Just keep driving." Frank stared at him for a moment longer, the shape of disbelief twisting in his stomach. He wanted to protest, to demand an answer, but something in the man's expression told him not to. It wasn't denial, nor arrogance, more like a plea, a request to let the night remain untouched by names. Reluctantly, Frank faced forward again and eased the cab back onto the road. The tires hissed, carrying them deeper into the quiet city. Inside the cab, the air felt heavier, charged, as if the small space now contained a secret too large to hold. Frank's thoughts tangled. He had lived long enough to dismiss rumors, to roll his eyes at tall tales spun by bartenders and drunks. Yet that voice still rang in his ears. Too powerful, too exact, too unmistakable. He tried to shake it off, but the recognition gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't reach. As they drove, Frank kept stealing glances in the mirror. The man sat composed, shoulders relaxed, as though nothing unusual had happened. But the echo of that song lingered between them, impossible to silence. Frank gripped the wheel tighter, his chest filled with both dread and awe. He felt suspended between reality and dream, the rain-washed streets blurring past like scenery in some surreal play. Every note he had heard a moment ago continued to pulse in his memory, more vivid than anything in years. The taxi rolled on through Memphis, a city soaked in history, carrying two men bound together by a voice too familiar to ignore, a voice that could shatter the thin wall between ordinary life and legend. The rain had thinned into a damp mist, leaving the streets slick and shining under the dim glow of Memphis street lamps. Frank's knuckles were white around the steering wheel. Every sound inside the cab felt magnified. The hum of the tires, the faint squeak of the wipers, even the passengers' steady breathing. That fragment of gospel still echoed in Frank's ears, too exact to dismiss, too extraordinary to pretend away. The silence stretched until it threatened to crush him. Finally, he couldn't hold back any longer. His voice trembled when he spoke. "Tell me straight," Frank said. Are you him? Are you Elvis Presley?" The question seemed to hang in the air like smoke, refusing to disperse. For a moment, the only response was quiet. The man in the back seat sat still, head angled toward the rain-speckled window, jaw clenched as though deciding whether to speak at all. Then he turned slightly, his face catching just enough of the dashboard's glow to reveal the outline of a tired smile. His voice came low, almost weary. "Yes, but tonight I don't want to be Elvis Presley. Tonight I'm just a man who needed someone to talk to." Frank felt a jolt shoot through his chest. His throat went dry, and for a second he nearly missed the stoplight ahead. He braked just in time, heart hammering as the truth crashed in. He'd suspected, of course. That voice could belong to no one else. But hearing the words was something different, something overwhelming. He swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Elvis replied gently. "Most folks I meet, they don't see me anymore. They see the posters, the shows, the headlines. Sometimes I just need someone who'll listen without expecting the king of rock and roll to perform." Frank couldn't stop staring at him in the mirror. What he saw wasn't the glittering image plastered across record sleeves and movie screens. There were no rhinestones, no spotlight, no crowd screaming his name. Just a man with lines around his mouth, shoulders heavy with something invisible. The cab rolled forward again, slipping through empty intersections. Neither spoke for a moment, and then Elvis leaned forward, resting his arm on the back of the front seat. His tone shifted, softer, almost hesitant. "Tell me something, Frank. Do you believe God puts the right people in our path at the right time?" The question caught Frank off guard. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'd like to think so. Hard to see it sometimes, though. Feels like life's been throwing the wrong things at me for a while now." Elvis studied him through the dark lenses. "I asked because I think maybe tonight isn't an accident. Maybe we both needed this ride." Frank's pulse quickened. The idea seemed impossible, that someone like Elvis Presley, with the entire world at his feet, could need a weary cab driver. Yet the way Elvis spoke, with a kind of naked honesty, made him believe it. The superstar leaned back again, exhaling heavily. You want to know a secret? The stage can be the loneliest place on earth. You walk out there, lights blazing, thousands screaming your name, and for a few minutes, it feels like you belong to the world. But once the curtain falls, it's just silence. You go back to your room, and there's nobody left who sees the man instead of the myth. Frank felt his chest tighten. He thought of his own nights, driving alone through rain-soaked streets, worrying about bills, about his wife working double shifts, about his little girl's frail body fighting an illness he couldn't afford to cure. Different lives, different scales of struggle. But in that instant, he felt a strange kinship. Elvis's voice dropped lower. There was a night once, years back, when I thought about giving it all up. I'd lost myself, couldn't see past the noise, the pressure, the pills they kept handing me so I could keep moving. I sat alone in a hotel room and thought about ending it. Just stopping everything. You wouldn't believe how close I came. The words hung heavy in the cramped cab. Frank's stomach knotted. He couldn't reconcile the man he was hearing, vulnerable, confessing dark truths, with the untouchable icon the world adored. "What stopped you?" Frank asked quietly. Elvis's fingers tapped against his knee, a slow rhythm. "My mama's voice. She wasn't there anymore, but I heard her clear as day, singing the old hymns. Reminded me that I was more than what the papers printed, that I still had something left to give. It pulled me back." The rawness of the confession left Frank speechless. He had never imagined he would hear something like this. Not from Elvis Presley, not from anyone so larger than life. And yet here it was, offered to him in the dim silence of a battered taxi. Elvis turned his head toward the window again, his reflection fractured in the streaks of water. "People think I've got everything a man could want. But most days, I'd trade it all just to sit at a kitchen table with folks who knew me before the fame. To hear laughter that isn't paid for by a ticket." Frank's eyes stung unexpectedly. He blinked hard, focusing on the road ahead. In that moment, he didn't see a celebrity. He saw another man bruised by life, searching for meaning, not so different from himself. The cab rattled over a pothole, pulling him back to the present. He cleared his throat. "You know, you're right. Maybe this isn't an accident. Maybe we both needed this talk." Elvis gave a small nod, lips pressed into a line that looked more grateful than any smile could. The rain outside had nearly stopped, but inside the cab, a storm of emotions had begun. Connection, recognition, the fragile bond between two strangers who suddenly weren't strangers anymore. The night was loosening its grip, though the city still wore its damp cloak. The rain had thinned to scattered drops, more like whispers than a storm, leaving the asphalt slick and shining as if someone had polished the streets with silver. Inside the cab, Frank drove without asking where next, waiting for the quiet voice in the back seat to guide him. After a long pause, Elvis leaned forward slightly. "Do me a favor, Frank. Don't take the highway. Turn off here. I want to see a part of town I haven't visited in years." Frank obeyed, steering onto narrower streets that branched away from the neon glow of downtown. The buildings grew smaller, more worn, their paint chipped, their porches sagging. These were not the grand avenues tourists photographed. This was Memphis stripped of glamour, the place where survival was the main occupation. Elvis's gaze stayed fixed on the window, though his reflection looked ghost-like in the glass, blurred by the lingering mist. "I grew up not far from here. One room, two parents working themselves to the bone. We didn't have much, barely enough to keep the lights on. But my mama, she had a voice. She'd sing while she washed dishes, while she prayed over me. I didn't understand then how much those sounds would shape me. Frank slowed the car. The streets here were almost empty, only a few stray dogs darting between shadows. A faint hum of electricity buzzed from loose wires overhead. He felt like he was trespassing inside someone else's memory. Elvis pointed toward a squat brick building, long since abandoned, its windows boarded. That place there. Church used to meet in the basement. One night, they asked me to sing. I was just a boy, knees knocking together. I thought I'd faint. But when I opened my mouth, it felt like something bigger than me came out. I didn't know then that my life was already changing. His words carried no vanity, only a kind of wonder, tinged with sadness. Frank found himself imagining a skinny kid in patched clothes, standing before a crowd, his voice trembling at first, then catching fire. That boy had no way of knowing the world would one day roar his name. They continued down the street, passing shuttered stores and narrow alleys. Then Elvis suddenly said, "Pull over." Frank did, easing the cab to the curb near a corner where a small group of teenagers huddled under an awning. One strummed a battered guitar, another tapped rhythm on an overturned crate. Their voices carried into the night, rough but alive, weaving strands of blues that belonged to this city as much as the bricks in its walls. Elvis rolled down his window, listening. A smile flickered across his face. Not the polished grin plastered on magazines, but a quiet, private smile. "That right there," he murmured. "That's the sound that raised me." Without warning, he opened the door and stepped into the damp street. Frank's breath caught. He wanted to shout, to remind him of the danger, the risk of being recognized. But Elvis walked with calm assurance, hands in his jacket pockets, head lowered just enough to pass as any man. The kids barely glanced up as he approached. One nodded politely, still strumming. Elvis lingered for a moment, then, almost playfully, joined in. His voice rose, not loud, but strong enough to blend with their chords. The harmony startled them. One boy's eyes widened, but he didn't connect the dots. To them, he was just another stranger, adding his note to their song. Frank sat frozen in the driver's seat, watching the scene unfold like something unreal. The man who filled arenas, who could silence a stadium with a single note, now stood on a wet Memphis sidewalk, harmonizing with boys who had no idea they were singing with the most famous voice in the world. For a brief moment, everything else fell away. The headlines, the bodyguards, the money, the crushing weight of fame. Here, in the drizzle under a flickering streetlight, Elvis was simply part of the music. Nothing more, nothing less. The song ended, laughter spilling out as the kids clapped each other on the back. Elvis gave them a nod, offered a quick word of encouragement, and then drifted back to the cab. He slid into the back seat, brushing rain from his jacket, eyes alight in a way Frank hadn't seen before. "They'll never know who just sang with them," Frank whispered, still astonished. "That's the beauty of it," Elvis replied softly. "Sometimes music doesn't need names. Sometimes it's enough just to be there, to share it." Frank turned the key, the engine grumbling back to life. As they pulled away, he glanced once more in the mirror. Elvis's face was calm, almost peaceful, as if those few moments on the sidewalk had restored something the spotlight had stolen. And Frank, still gripping the wheel, realized he was witnessing a truth that no headline could ever capture. The king of rock and roll was also a man who longed, more than anything, to vanish into a simple song on a forgotten street. The hour had grown late enough that Memphis seemed half asleep. Streetlights hummed over vacant intersections, and the mist from earlier storms had thinned into a pale fog that hovered near the ground. Frank's taxi moved through it steadily, the headlights carving two narrow paths ahead. Elvis had been silent since leaving the group of boys, lost in some private thought. The hush inside the cab was almost reverent, broken only by the soft rattle of the engine. Frank felt reluctant to disturb it, but eventually Elvis leaned forward, voice calm, deliberate. "Would you mind heading east a little? There's a place I'd like to show you." Frank adjusted his route, curiosity stirring again. They drove past warehouses, then out toward quieter streets lined with industrial yards and empty lots. After 20 minutes, the hulking shape of a hospital emerged from the fog, its windows glowing with sterile fluorescence. Elvis pointed toward the entrance. "Pull in here." Frank frowned. "The hospital? You feeling all right?" "I'm fine," Elvis answered with a faint smile. "But I want you to see something." Frank guided the cab under the awning. The hospital grounds looked weary, peeling paint on the pillars, a few flickering lights in the lot. It wasn't one of the city's wealthy institutions. This was the kind of place that patched people up when no other hospital would. Elvis sat forward, elbows on his knees, and spoke in a tone different from before, almost confessional. "Every now and then, I come here, not for myself, for the folks inside. Sometimes I cover bills for families who can't pay. Sometimes it's a piece of equipment the ward needs. Nobody knows it's me. That's the way I like it." Frank stared at him in the mirror, unable to form words. The idea of a man so hounded by cameras walking into a hospital to quietly pay strangers' debts seemed almost impossible. Yet Elvis said it with such simple conviction. There was no doubting him. "You ever think," Elvis continued, "that the chances we're given in life aren't really for us alone? That maybe the Lord blesses us so we can pass it along?" Frank swallowed hard. His thoughts jumped to his daughter, pale, thin, her chest rising weakly under the weight of illness. He thought of the bills stacking higher, of his wife folding aprons at the diner after midnight. The ache of helplessness surged so strong he had to grip the wheel tighter. Elvis turned his head, studying him. "You told me earlier about your little girl. How old is she again?" "8, Frank answered softly. "Too young to be fighting like she does." "I remember every word you said," Elvis murmured, "and I believe nothing you told me tonight was by accident." Before Frank could reply, Elvis reached for the door handle. "Wait here a moment." And then he was gone, striding toward the sliding doors that swallowed him into the building. Frank sat rigid, the engine idling. His heart pounded with confusion, suspicion, and something else, hope so sharp it almost hurt. Minutes passed. The hospital's automatic doors hissed open and closed as nurses came and went, their white shoes squeaking across the wet pavement. Frank imagined Elvis moving down some corridor, anonymous in his jacket and glasses, speaking to clerks behind desks, signing something, leaving something behind. The wait stretched long enough for doubt to creep in. Frank tapped the steering wheel with nervous fingers, wondering what on earth a man like that could be doing inside at this hour. Then, finally, Elvis reappeared. He walked calmly, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, face unreadable behind the dark lenses. He opened the door and slipped back into the back seat, settling without a word. Frank couldn't contain himself. "What did you—" Elvis cut him off with a quiet gesture. "Don't ask. Just know that sometimes faith is enough. Your little girl, things are going to be all right." The words hit like a blow. Frank's throat closed, a flood of emotion rising too fast to manage. He wanted to demand details, to press for explanations, but something in Elvis's tone, gentle yet unshakably certain, told him not to. The cab eased back onto the street, headlights slicing through the fog. The hospital lights faded in the rearview mirror, but Frank carried their glow inside him. He didn't know what Elvis had done, or why he had chosen this night, this cab, this conversation. All he knew was that something had shifted. For the first time in years, the knot of fear in his chest loosened, and though the world outside remained cold and damp, inside that taxi, Frank felt as if he'd been handed a glimpse of grace. The taxi slid back onto the open road, its tires humming over the damp pavement. The hospital's fluorescent glow disappeared in the mirrors, swallowed by the fog. Frank felt lighter somehow, though the silence between him and his passenger weighed with unspoken questions. He wanted to ask what had just happened in that building, but something in Elvis's stillness warned him not to push. The cab's heater rattled, filling the interior with a faint hum. Elvis leaned back, his head resting against the seat, his sunglasses catching the reflection of passing streetlights. When he finally spoke, his words came not like a performance, but like fragments of a diary whispered aloud. "You know, Frank, people think fame is freedom. They see the houses, the cars, the crowds. What they don't see is the cage. Every room I walk into, I'm expected to be larger than life. People don't look for the man anymore. They look for the myth. After a while, you start to wonder if the man's even still there." Frank's grip on the wheel tightened. He'd spent years feeling invisible himself, just another working stiff in a city full of them. But the idea that Elvis Presley, of all people, could feel erased by his own legend struck him hard. Elvis's voice dropped, almost a murmur. "Sometimes I lie awake in Graceland, hearing the sound of my own breath echo off the walls, and I think, maybe I've been swallowed whole by this thing the world calls me. Maybe I'm lost inside it. There are nights when I'm afraid of myself, afraid of what I might do to quiet the noise." Frank felt a chill. Though the heater was warm, he didn't dare look back. He just kept the cab steady, his heart beating fast. This was no confession meant for the stage. This was a truth bared in the small hours, in the safety of anonymity. After a long pause, Elvis spoke again, his tone steadier. "But nights like this, riding through the city with no schedule, no cameras, that's when I feel closest to who I really am. Just a boy from Tupelo who loved to sing." Frank swallowed. Maybe that's all anyone needs to be. Just themselves. Elvis gave a faint, almost bitter chuckle. "Easier said than done when the world wants you to be everything else." He shifted forward, resting an arm across the back of the seat. "Let me ask you something, Frank. You ever think about how you'll be remembered? When all's said and done, what will be left with your name on it?" The question hit harder than Frank expected. He'd never given it much thought. For years, he'd believed his life would fade unnoticed. Just long hours, worn-out paychecks, and the endless grind of survival. But hearing it from Elvis, a man worshipped by millions, reframed the question entirely. "I guess," Frank began slowly, "I figured no one would remember me. Maybe my wife, my daughter for a while. But when you spend your life behind a wheel, people don't write songs about that." Elvis studied him closely, his voice soft but insistent. "You're wrong about that. You'll be remembered by the ones who matter. The way you care for your little girl, the sacrifices you make. That's a legacy bigger than any gold record. Don't let anyone tell you it's small." Frank's eyes stung. He blinked hard, focusing on the white lines stretching ahead. No fanfare, no flashing bulbs, just two men in the quiet dark, one reminding the other of his worth. For a while they drove without speaking, both absorbed in their thoughts. Outside, the fog was lifting, and the eastern horizon showed the first suggestion of dawn, a thin gray seam pressing against the night. Elvis broke the silence, his voice steadier now, though still tinged with melancholy. The strange thing about fame is, it makes you eternal in the eyes of strangers, but it can steal eternity from your soul. That's why I ask myself, more and more these days, when the curtain falls for good, what part of me will remain? Frank didn't know how to answer. The weight of the question sat between them, too heavy for casual words. Instead, he drove on, the road stretching ahead like a tightrope between two worlds, one of silence, one of song. The sky was beginning to shift, the blackness softening to charcoal. Frank realized that for the rest of his life, no matter what happened, he would remember this ride. Not as a cab shift, not as a chance encounter, but as the night he sat beside a man stripped of every illusion, asking the same questions that haunted ordinary souls. And as the first trace of dawn broke through the fog, Frank understood. He wasn't simply driving Elvis Presley. He was escorting another man through the fragile boundary between despair and hope, fame and obscurity, myth and truth. The city was dissolving into dawn. A gray band stretched across the horizon, thinning the shadows, while the street lamps blinked tiredly as if ready to surrender to the sun. Frank drove with a kind of quiet reverence now, as though the cab itself had turned into a vessel carrying something far greater than two men. The conversation they'd shared still lingered in the air, fragile as smoke. Frank wondered if it would end there, if Elvis had said all he needed to. But then, the man in the back seat shifted, reaching slowly into his jacket pocket. From it, he drew a small notebook, its edges frayed, the cover softened from years of being carried. He turned it over in his hands before opening it on his lap. The pages, yellowed at the corners, were filled with dense handwriting, loops and scratches, the ink faded in places. Elvis ran a thumb across the paper, almost tenderly. "This goes everywhere with me," he said, his voice low, confiding. "It's not a diary, exactly. Just pieces of me, lines for songs, prayers I never said out loud, thoughts I couldn't tell anyone else. It's where I go when the noise gets too loud." Frank kept his eyes on the road, but his ears strained to catch every word. He felt as though he were trespassing into a place sacred and unguarded, yet Elvis seemed intent on letting him in. The singer flipped to a page and began to read softly. "When the night dies, the ones who truly knew you are the only proof you lived at all." The line settled heavily in the cab, more powerful for its simplicity. Frank swallowed, throat dry. He could picture Elvis scribbling those words in some anonymous hotel room, alone with his doubts. Elvis continued turning the pages, pausing here and there on a line, whispering them almost to himself. Some were fragments of melodies. Others were confessions too raw for any stage. Then he stopped, eyes fixed on one particular passage. Slowly, he tore the page free. The sound of paper ripping was almost startling in the quiet. He folded it once, then looked up. "Do you want this?" he asked. Frank blinked, stunned. What do you mean?" "This page," Elvis said, holding it gently between two fingers. "It's mine, but maybe it should be yours. You've listened tonight, not because of who I'm supposed to be, but because you cared enough to hear me. That means something." Frank shook his head quickly, panic rising. "I can't take that. That's part of you. It doesn't belong with me." Elvis gave a faint smile, weary but insistent. "Maybe that's why it does. Sometimes we need to trust strangers more than the people who surround us every day. Fame takes trust, and shatters it. But you, Frank, you've asked for nothing. You've given me something I can't buy. That makes you the right one to hold this." He leaned forward, pressing the folded page into Frank's hand before the driver could protest again. The paper felt warm, fragile, as though it carried not just ink, but the weight of a man's soul. Frank's pulse raced. "Why me?" he whispered. Elvis leaned back, his expression unreadable behind the dark glasses. "Because you'll remember me as a man, not as a monument." The cab moved steadily through streets beginning to stir. Bakers unlocking shops, milk trucks rattling across intersections, the faint hum of a city waking. Yet inside that car, the world felt suspended. Frank gripped the page tightly, terrified of damaging it, yet more terrified of the responsibility it represented. For years, he'd believed his life was invisible, unremarkable. And now, here was a fragment of Elvis Presley's unguarded truth, entrusted to him alone. Elvis returned to flipping through the notebook, but he didn't read aloud again. The silence was comfortable, though, as if they had reached a deeper layer of trust that needed no words. Frank realized something then. The greatest treasure a man can give isn't money or fame or spectacle. It's vulnerability. And tonight, that treasure had been laid gently into his hands. The dawn spread wider, painting the streets in pale light. For a moment, Frank wondered if, years from now, anyone would believe him if he told this story. He already knew the answer. He wouldn't tell it at all. This secret was too sacred to share. Elvis closed the notebook carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he sat in silence, gazing out the window at a city both familiar and foreign, as if searching for pieces of the boy he once was. And Frank, holding the folded page like a relic, knew the ride had shifted again, from confession to covenant. This was no longer just a fare. This was a bond sealed in secrecy, fragile and eternal. The city was no longer sleeping. Dawn pressed its pale hand against the skyline, thinning the mist and waking the streets. Frank's cab rolled toward the International Hotel, its battered frame dwarfed by the tower's gleaming facade. As they approached, the quiet they had shared began to fray. Outside the entrance, figures were already gathering, fans clutching scrapbooks and cameras, reporters craning for a glimpse, bodyguards standing stiff as sentinels. The sight pulled Frank back to reality with a sharp jolt. The fragile world of the night was about to vanish. Elvis sat up straighter, shoulders tightening. Frank saw the shift happen in real time. The man who had bared his fears and memories was retreating, replaced by the legend the crowd demanded. His jaw hardened, his posture straightened, and the faint smile that had once been private now carried polish, rehearsed, yet convincing. "Stop here," Elvis said softly. Frank eased the taxi under the awning. Before opening the door, Elvis rested a hand briefly on the back of Frank's seat. "Stay a moment. Let me face them first." He stepped out into the pale morning. Immediately, shouts broke out. "Elvis, over here! Smile, King! Just one picture!" Camera flashes burst like tiny explosions, cutting through the early light. Fans surged forward, arms reaching, voices rising in a chorus of adoration. Frank sat frozen behind the wheel, watching. Only minutes earlier, this man had handed him a fragile page from a worn notebook, a piece of his soul. Now he was armor-clad, every gesture calculated to satisfy the hunger of the crowd. It was like watching someone put on a mask, dazzling, unbreakable, and utterly isolating. Elvis shook hands, signed a few scraps of paper, offered that famous grin that made people swoon. To them, he was untouchable again, a figure larger than any mortal could be. Frank felt the contrast like a blow. He alone had seen what lived behind that mask, and the knowledge weighed heavy. After a few minutes, Elvis turned, excused himself with a practiced nod, and walked back to the taxi. He leaned down at the open window, his glasses hiding his eyes, but not the warmth in his voice. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, almost as an afterthought, he slid a plain envelope onto the passenger seat. Without another word, he straightened and let himself be swallowed by the throng. The cameras, the clamoring voices, the endless demands of fame. Within seconds, he was gone, carried up the hotel steps, leaving only echoes behind. Frank's hands shook as he picked up the envelope. It was unmarked, ordinary, yet heavy with something more than paper. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a stack of bills thick enough to make his breath catch, far more than he could earn in months of endless shifts. Nestled among them was a small folded note, written in the same hand he had seen in the notebook. "Sometimes we meet for reasons we cannot explain. Take care of your little girl. Believe that this night was not chance." Frank sat stunned, the morning light flooding through the windshield, illuminating the words. He could hear the muffled roar of the crowd outside, the chaotic symphony of fame. But inside the taxi, everything was still. The money would change his life, yes. His daughter could finally get the care she needed. But it wasn't the cash that left him trembling. It was the message, the reminder that a man worshipped by millions had chosen him, an anonymous cab driver, to trust with secrets, with faith, with gratitude. He pressed the envelope to his chest for a moment, overwhelmed. Through the windshield, he watched Elvis vanish behind the hotel's glass doors, swallowed back into the world that demanded his myth and denied his humanity. Frank whispered to himself, "I saw the real man." And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own life shift. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was part of a story no one else would ever believe, a witness to a truth the world would never see. The cab's engine idled softly, as if waiting for him to move. But Frank lingered, staring at the envelope, at the note, at the crowd still buzzing outside. He realized he had been entrusted with something more powerful than wealth. The knowledge that behind the crown, the legend, the endless roar of adoration, there was simply a man who longed to be understood. And that trust, fragile and priceless, was now his to carry. The cab pulled away from the hotel, its frame rattling as it climbed the gentle incline of Union Avenue. The roar of the crowd faded behind him, swallowed by the ordinary hum of a waking city. The envelope lay on the passenger seat, the folded note resting atop the stack of bills, as if daring Frank to believe it was real. He drove in silence, both hands gripping the wheel. Memphis was beginning to stir. Bakers hauling crates of bread into storefronts, paper boys slinging damp newspapers onto porches, street sweepers brushing away the debris of the night. The rising sun slipped through the mist, throwing long beams across the slick pavement. Frank's chest ached with emotions too tangled to sort. Relief fought with disbelief. Gratitude wrestled with awe. He had picked up a stranger in worn denim, listened to a voice too familiar to mistake, and ended the night holding evidence of a meeting that would never make the morning paper. By the time he reached his neighborhood, the light had grown brighter, cutting through curtains and washing over the modest houses. He parked in front of his own, the engine sputtering into stillness. For a long moment, he just sat, staring at the envelope, unwilling to break the spell. Finally, he picked it up and stepped inside. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee. His wife, hair pinned back and apron still tied from her overnight shift, looked up from the stove. "You're home late again," she said softly, weary but kind. Then she saw his face, the dazed expression, the trembling hands, and frowned. "What happened?" Frank couldn't answer. Instead, he pulled her close, holding her tightly, burying his face in her shoulder. She stiffened at first, startled, then melted into the embrace, as if she understood that words would only cheapen whatever this moment contained. On the table he laid the envelope. When she opened it, her eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Frank, what is this?" "Enough," he whispered hoarsely. "Enough to help her. Enough to change everything." They both turned toward the small bedroom at the end of the hall, where their daughter slept beneath a thin quilt, her breathing shallow but steady. For the first time in months, Frank felt a surge of hope strong enough to lift the crushing weight that had sat on his chest. In the days that followed, appointments were scheduled, doctors consulted, treatments arranged. Bills that had seemed like immovable mountains began to shrink. But though the money opened doors, it was not what lingered most in Frank's mind. What stayed with him were the words. "Sometimes we meet for reasons we cannot explain." He replayed the night over and over. The quiet dignity of the man in the back seat, the unexpected honesty, the worn notebook, the page now hidden safely in Frank's dresser drawer. He never told anyone. Not his wife, not his daughter, not a single soul. When neighbors asked about his sudden change in fortune, he muttered something about an old debt finally paid. He kept the truth locked away, a treasure more fragile than diamonds. Years passed. The world changed. Music changed. His daughter grew strong and healthy. And then, one August morning, the news broke. Elvis Presley had died. Radios across Memphis mourned with trembling voices. Fans flooded the streets. Television anchors spoke of the end of an era. Frank sat in his living room, staring at the black and white image of Graceland swarmed with weeping crowds. His chest tightened. He thought of the man who had sat in his cab one rainy night, not the idol plastered across the screens, but the weary soul who had asked him, "Do you believe God puts the right people in our path at the right time?" That evening, Frank opened the dresser drawer. From beneath folded shirts, he drew out the page. Yellowed now, edges curling. He unfolded it carefully and read again the words written in Elvis's unmistakable hand. "When the night dies, the ones who truly knew you are the only proof you lived at all." His throat ached, but he smiled through the sting in his eyes. He realized he had been given something more enduring than wealth, a secret gospel of kindness, whispered to him alone. A truth that the brightest stage lights could never reveal. Frank folded the page back into its creases and placed it carefully inside a small wooden box. He knew he would never speak of it aloud. It wasn't for the world. It was for him, the cab driver who had once carried a king, not of music, but of humanity. And as he sat quietly in the fading light, he whispered into the stillness, "The real glory isn't on stage. It's in the lives you touch when no one is watching." For the rest of his days, Frank carried that night in his heart, a night that had remade him. And though no monument would ever mark it, though no newspaper would ever print it, it stood as his private testament, that even legends seek simplicity, and even ordinary men can be chosen to guard extraordinary secrets.